Now I'd like to introduce Mattice Wanat, who is director of Opera NUOVA in the city. And for those of you who have not met Kim and not been introduced to her boundless energy and incredible commitment in creating an opera company that is of national standing in this country, in training young singers. She puts on several operas every June in this city. If you have not been to these operas, then I would suggest this is about the equivalent to not eating right. It is absolutely so indispensable to Canada's opera culture. It is remarkable what she has done. And for 15 years as well, she has been an instructor at the University of Alberta for the past, I believe, 24 years. And also, her background is in drama. And she really, her background is really all the arts, quite frankly. She's eclectic, she's interesting, she's wonderful, and I love her. And I'm glad she's here, and she's going to talk and share about a lot of things to do with Butterfly. So please welcome Kim. In Bohème, in the Act 1 duet, especially Merla Pavarotti, when Franny just sort of curves the voice, and she's obviously charmed by Rodolfo and sings that beautiful triad, and it's not really a triad, she just curves her voice all around in the most beautiful way. But that is a totally Puccini artifact. You know, that would never happen in Verdi or Renaissance. It is one of those great moments where they're being intimate just by talking to each other. And that is a Puccinian idea that is so beautiful, and that's also what all builds this all up. And what I want to ask is, any experience you can impart about that amount of time that does get spent on just a few pages, whether from this rehearsal process to which you were privy for a few hours, or even your own when you're training young singers who are going into opera, really I think in the largest way for the first time. Can you tell us more about that? Why does it take so much time?
Well, there's a lot involved, right? First of all, we're singing in a different language. So, and as a director, you're working very hard to make sure that you're working with enormous clarity. So, for instance, if Tim were to just speak to Pinkerton without Suzuki and Sharpless sitting and listening, right, and hearing the dialogue, then he's talking to Pinkerton about what he wants him to be thinking about underneath the text, which is really where the action lies. So it's the subtext, we call that in the theatrical world. But it's eminently important that everybody playing in that scene understands exactly what the subtextual message is, because that's what you're responding to. So Tim, so many different times this afternoon, he would be usually in English. He's not saying the actual text of the opera, but he's actually saying the subtext of the character as he's talking about Suzuki walking Pinkerton into the room. Because Tim's impression is that Suzuki, when she first sees that Pinkerton's come back, she's surprised, but she's happy, elated. And for Margaret Thompson, who's playing Suzuki, she's never played that moment that way. She's always played it in a negative way, like something's up. And Tim,
it's somber, yeah.
Yeah, and Tim said, but there isn't anything to suggest that she would be sad or upset. She would be surprised because she believed that he wasn't going to show up. And especially because they waited all night. The boat had come in, and they were waiting and waiting, thinking that Pinkerton was going to come. He doesn't come, and Suzuki had kind of decided he's not coming. And so she's shocked, but she's also elated because she sees him there. So that was a real beautiful moment in a rehearsal to watch, where an artist who's played the role before had to kind of go, okay, let me just step back here, let me rethink this for a moment, and let me kind of figure out how that's going to go. And when am I going to make that discovery that he's actually not back for Butterfly? there's a very beautiful moment, and it's, you know, not very long after, 2 pages later, she sees La Donna in the back, and Kate Pinkerton is out in the back garden looking at Mount Fuji, and she sees this woman, and she says, "Who's that?" Right? And that's her moment of going, something's very, very wrong here. Something is not as it's supposed to be. So Tim really all the time was speaking the language of the artists to make sure that in their mind they're tracking the English in behind the Italian. And sometimes tracking their actual dialogue and sometimes tracking their subtextual dialogue. But that's when you get, it's fun to watch directors in that mode, and from my point of view, it was refreshing because I'm a director that I kind of have everybody's stories in my head and I know exactly what everybody's subtext is, and I'll often feel like I'm giving them too much, I'm saying too much, I need for them to be able to create this themselves. And here was Tim, who I really admire as a director, doing exactly the same thing. And I thought, oh, okay, that's refreshing. That's good to know. That's good to know that somebody else does that. And it was interesting because he was always open to hearing new ideas, and he understood Margaret's first kind of opposition and going, how am I going to work this? And are you sure that she should react that way? But he was also clear about what he needed and wanted from that scene and was able to build it. So it takes time. It takes a lot of time because just even something like Suzuki's entrance to welcome Sharpless and Pinkerton in, it's, you know, that there is music that happens there, and all of that has to be timed. She has to get a real sense of how much time is it going to take her to make a believable moment happen for the audience, and so that it all times out. I do think that there are composers like Verdi and Puccini who they make directing extraordinarily easy. I always say, all you really have to do is listen to the music. They've pretty much directed the piece. And they really have. They've directed the piece because the emotion of the piece is inside the music. So the only thing that a director has to do is listen very, very carefully and then interpret with clarity what they're actually hearing. I think Tim does that masterfully.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The score is a big informer. And what those harmonies are saying, what instruments are saying them, is also a big deal. Puccini actually regarded himself as something from a young age of somebody who was a symphonist who wrote for the theater. That was something that he had as a revelation when he saw Aida as a young man. And he knew he had to write for the theater, but he knew that he wanted to write symphonies at a huge, large extent for the theater. And those colors, the punctiliousness of his orchestration, always reveals the directorial intent that really one ought to take. And from what you've described in that scene, there's absolutely no evidence at all that Suzuki should play this in a somber way until she actually sees Kate Pinkerton. It's absolutely true for that music. So, thank you, that was a wonderful answer. So, after the Second World War, what was the feminist perspective in scholarship, as we see it now, toward women and their role and how they were seen by the West after Ms. Duncan's comments, of course, which I thought were great. In the tradition of Said's Orientalism, what happens between, say, 1950 and 1980 to women?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And one of the things is, of course, after the end of the war, Japan went in under American occupation, right? So there was General MacArthur's, reforms, 5 major reforms, and women's rights was the one of the most important part of this reform. So, of course, many things has changed, I think, and women getting more education and participation, but at the same time, in a basic level, I don't really think that I should overemphasize the change, because those change usually comes very slowly. And society, in a society like Japan, I think that transition was quite slow. Yeah, and I still think that Japanese society is quite male-centered. So people still, the state still expect women to play gendered role, like, you know, cult of domesticity still survives in Japanese society. That is my feeling, yeah.
I have another question, just out of interest. When I did all of my feminist studies in Toronto, I was always fascinated with feminine voices, the sense of female culture and female perspective. This was very important to me, and it has informed me in my teaching a great deal. And I'm wondering how much that culture thrives in contemporary Japan today, of a feminist voice in terms of theater, kabuki, anything at all.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because kabuki is a quite different thing, because everybody is a man, right? Yeah, basically, yeah. So, and sometimes this image of, sorry, your question is,
how is that deconstructed?
How women's
How does that change?
image deconstructed, right, in modern Japan, yeah, in contemporary Japan. Yeah, I think to some extent, of course, Japan is completely westernized now. So in that sense, there were a number of, you know, feminist movement, you know, coming from Western society, and there are a number of, you know, women rights, you know, politicians and, you know, writers and, you know, cultural theorists, you know, try to enforce the higher status of women in Japan. But as I said, yeah, Japan is still a very, how do I say, like, still has a gender roles in many places, right? So, and for example, at the workplace, if you just compare the average salary between women and men, it's absolutely unbelievable, like, because the gap is very high, and at the same time, women's promotion is quite limited.
Well, I think we'll bring the panel proceedings to a close and ask if there are any questions on the floor. From the audience for us to answer.
If you know, what would have been the average age of marriage during the time? Because I think if we're thinking about how the contemporary society would have viewed the difference between a child and an adult, I think that's something that's important to think about when we're updating.
Yes,
and I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I think that's 15 years old. It's not too unusual in those days, and I actually don't know the average age of marriage. But actually, the first Japanese law to define how old women can get married is probably like 1898, and this opera was this wedding was supposed to happen in around like 1891, if I'm correct. Yeah, that kind of era. So before them, people, you know, girls can marry at any time, and it was not quite unusual. Like, especially like geisha or sometimes prostitutes, and, you know, those people who need money get married as soon as possible. But sometimes this marriage, I still think that's in this opera, this marriage is some slightly, you know, fake in many ways.
Right, yes.
Yeah, so it's not formal marriage, but it's common to marry to a very rich man at this age. And if we think about that, even now in Japan, you know, 16 years old can get married, right? So yeah, so it's only 1 year difference. So yeah, I think.
Well, the question more or less is that for us, when we watch Canadian culture represented, and we see other nations representing us as people who sort of go out and hunt, you know, moose, and we all come in our backyard, and we all drink beer, and we're all a bunch of hosers, eh? And you know, I mean, I think it rolls off a lot of us, but he's asking, what is the feeling like? Is it similar to how we feel, or is there something much deeper in terms of national pride of how you feel that this misrepresentation is offensive, perhaps?
from my perspective,
Yes, or Japanese perspective at any
Japanese
time.
perspective, of course, to some extent, people create their own self-image, right? Canadians, have this sort of image, and at the same
Hockey.
yeah, and this kind of image is perhaps produced and reproduced throughout, international exchange, I think. So, yeah, my answer to that question, actually, I don't know how to answer this question, but yes, I really think that, national image and pride and that kind of thing always, constructed and deconstructed and erased and recreated, according to the context and what, part of the image will be most attractive internationally and domestically, of course. So I don't know if I answered that question, but...
Well, the Paris World's Fair, I think it's interesting, your comment really spoke to this, that there was a marketing ploy of Japan and the masculine-feminine divide, the dichotomy, and what Japan was like and how it should be marketed to the West, that sense of cultivating a self-image that you talked about. And do we not, as Canadians, adhere or accede to that in the closing ceremonies of the Vancouver Olympics? Do we all remember that? I mean, some people thought it was awful. Some people thought it was perfectly fine. But, it was that sense of, this is what we've decided that we're going to market to the world, whether we were that or not. So these sorts of things are part and parcel of that message. Does that help in any way, to a degree?